The story of the resurrection of Lazarus, recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, has long stood as one of the most powerful images of the authority and mercy of Jesus, a man who had been dead for 4 days, laid in the tomb, wrapped in burial cloths, with the stench of death already spreading, yet, with just a call, "Lazarus, come out," he walked out of the grave, restored to life amid the astonishment of many. For modern readers, this story is easily categorized as myth or an irrational miracle. But if we approach it again, not with hasty dismissal, but with a deeper gaze at the boundary between body and soul, death and life, science and faith, then the story of Lazarus is no longer merely a supernatural event, but a resurrection containing multiple layers of meaning. Let's begin with Lazarus himself. He was no stranger. Lazarus was the brother of Martha and Mary, 2 women whom Jesus had visited, shared meals with, and stayed with in their home. Previous passages reveal a close relationships, so close that when Lazarus fell ill, his sisters did not say much, simply sending word, "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." This detail is important. Lazarus was not just any patient, he was beloved, and it is this love that, in the story, becomes the conduit for something greater than illness, the restoration of the soul. Through the wounds of the body, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he did not immediately go. He waited 2 days, and when he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. This is a notable detail. According to ancient Jewish custom, it was believed that the soul lingered near the body for 3 days after death, as a hope that the dead might be revived. But by the 4th day, this hope was considered entirely lost. When John writes that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, he affirms that this was not a natural revival or a misdiagnosis. This was a real death, both physically and symbolically. Precisely because the death was complete, the act of resurrection became one that transcended all limits, biological, cultural, and theological. From another perspective, people have questioned whether Lazarus's revival could be explained medically. Some modern opinions suggest he might have been in a deep coma or in a state of clinical death, where the heart stops and breathing ceases. But brain function is not entirely lost and can be restored after some time. However, several details refute this argument. First, Lazarus had been buried according to proper Jewish rites, wrapped in burial cloths, placed in a cave, and sealed with a large stone. This shows that his family and community had confirmed his death as real. No one naturally revives when their mouth and nose are wrapped in burial cloths for 4 days in a tomb, deprived of oxygen. Second, when Jesus arrived, Martha said clearly, "Lord, by this time he stinks, for he has been dead for days." Decomposition had begun. In the Middle Eastern climate, this happens very quickly. This was not a vegetative state. It was a body entering the process of decay. So, if Lazarus was raised, it was not just a restoration of blood flow or heartbeat, it was a complete re-establishment of the structure of every cell, nerve, and conscious life, something that even today's most advanced resuscitation technology cannot achieve. At this point, the story of Lazarus moves to another level, the level of resurrection as a phenomenon that transcends time. In his prayer before calling Lazarus out of the tomb, Jesus said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I say this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Jesus did not ask for Lazarus to be raised. He confirmed that it had already happened, as if the resurrection had already occurred on a spiritual level before it manifested in the flesh. When he called out, that call did not just echo in the air, it resonated at the deepest level, where soul and body, once separated, were reconnected. Could it be that what Jesus did was not to force life back, but to call at the right frequency, so that the soul that had left the body would return to its original resonance with its own flesh? In that context, the call "Lazarus, come out" was not just a command. It was an awakening code, a sacred signal, a frequency that touched the deepest point of human identity, where the self is formed by presence and love, to reawaken life that had already shattered. If this is true, then resurrection is no longer a miracle opposed to science, but a higher level of reality, where the right word, the right love, and the right presence can reverse the process of death. Lazarus, who walked out of the tomb, was not just a witness to a miracle. He became a living symbol of the soul's capacity for restoration through wounds, of life transcending the limits of death, a medical case not bound by time but rising, Above it, when Lazarus walked out of the tomb, he did not emerge in a glorified body like Jesus after the resurrection. He was still wrapped in burial cloths, still bearing the marks of death. And the first thing Jesus said afterward was not a sermon or congratulations, but a very simple phrase: "Loose him and let him go." This small detail suggests something profound. Resurrection is not completed by coming back to life, but by being freed from the constraints that have wrapped around life. The burial cloths are not just funeral rites. They are symbols of the limits, wounds, and memories of death that the resurrected still carry. Asterisk in this view. Lazarus is a living symbol of a kind of existence that is interrupted and then restored, but not entirely as before. He did not become supernatural or disappear into heaven. He continued to live in society, eating, drinking, and communicating, but with an indelible mark: "I have died, and I have been called back to life." Later, passages describe how many, upon seeing Lazarus, believed in Jesus. They did not need to hear arguments. The presence of someone who had died and was now alive was a testimony stronger than any words. This reveals a truth. There are forms of resurrection that do not need to be explained. They only need to exist. A person who has been shattered, wounded, wrapped in pain and separation, if healed and continues to live with humility, silence, and a gentle gaze, then that presence itself is a miracle. And perhaps God is still doing similar things, not necessarily by raising the dead, but by reviving things within us that seem to have died completely. Love that has broken, hope that has faded, a calling forgotten, faith that has dried up. These can all be Lazaruses within the soul, buried in silence, perhaps already smelling of decay. But then, at the right moment, a sacred call sounds from deep within, and what seemed dead begins to stir. At a deeper symbolic level, Lazarus can be seen as an image of humanity, imprisoned in the tomb of history, wrapped in the cloths of war, fear, selfishness, and division. And God, not by decree or violence, but by a call, awakens the most sacred thing in every person: the ability to return to oneself in the light of life. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died," Martha said. But Jesus replied, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." In the original context, this was a word of comfort, but in the light of quantum reality, it becomes an ontological statement. Life is not limited by heartbeat or brainwaves, but is a state of presence where the soul remains connected to a higher level of existence. Lazarus had died, but he was raised. This does not change the laws of biology, but it places a question mark on their limits. For if life can be restored by a word, by love, by a presence at the right moment, then perhaps death is not the end, but a door. And those who survive, who have stepped out of their own tombs, do not just live, they become signs of another reality, where resurrection is no longer a myth but a possibility, quietly unfolding in every soul called by name. Lazarus said nothing after his resurrection. There is no testimony, no sermon, no description of his emotions. The Bible leaves him silent, as if the wonder is too deep for words. That silence in the Gospel of John is not an omission but a symbol. True resurrection cannot be explained. It can only be lived. That silent presence becomes the anchor for many who believe. They do not need proof. They need someone who has passed through death and continues to live in everyday life. Such a person, with a strange quietness in their eyes, can change the faith of an entire village. And for the religious leaders of the time, that presence was so dangerous that they wanted to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus. This shows that resurrection, even if not loud, is a threat to those who want to maintain death. Because when a person steps out of the tomb, every system of control by fear, pain, or finality loses its power. Could it be that in every age, God is still calling each person? In a similar way, not everyone steps out of the tomb by a spectacular miracle, but many have come back to life after a sorrow that seemed to kill them, after a betrayal that left them paralyzed, after a failure, a loss, a door slammed shut. They are not as before, but they walk slowly, carrying a wound and something quietly bright inside. Such people do not need to justify themselves. Their presence, like Lazarus, is evidence that death does not have the final word. If we imagine the soul as a field of living energy, then death is a structural rupture. But the strange thing is, that crack is not always destruction. In many cases, it opens a door for light to enter. Lazarus carried a body that had died, but he was raised and continued to live with that body. As if resurrection does not erase the wound, but sanctifies it. In today's world, where people flee from every wound, every trace of pain, the story of Lazarus says something different. It is precisely what has been shattered that God touches, not to hide it, but to prove that even in the wound, life can arise. Resurrection does not happen only in a moment. It is a process. A person can be called out of the tomb, but they must relearn how to walk, breathe, eat, speak, and be present as someone who carries the memory of death but is given new life. Lazarus stepped out but was still bound, and Jesus told the community around him, "Loose him and let him go." This means the community has a responsibility to release the resurrected from old constraints. Resurrection is not only the work of God, it needs a community that recognizes the sacred happening and does not hold it back in fear or doubt. Perhaps this is why the story of Lazarus is placed just before the account of the Passion, as a sign that the death of Jesus is not a defeat, but a gateway to a greater resurrection, not just for one person, but for all humanity. Lazarus is the first step, one person, one body called back to life. But through this, the Bible opens a deeper vision. Every person, every soul, every wounded heart can be called out of the darkness. And the most wonderful thing is that no one calls themselves Lazarus did not open his own tomb. He did not remove his own burial cloths. He did not choose to come back to life himself. He only responded to a call. The quiet question arises, if today you hear that call in a deep night, a moment of silence, are you ready to step out? You do not need to be certain. You only need to stir, to recognize that you are still called by name. And then life, however fragile, can begin again, not as before, but deeper and truer. Like Lazarus, who had died, was raised, and was no longer a victim of death, but a witness to a life that transcends time. There is a quiet but haunting detail. After his resurrection, Lazarus is not described as going out to preach, writing books, or becoming a spiritual leader. He returned to ordinary life, but that silent presence made the Jewish leaders decide to kill Lazarus as well, because many who saw him believed in Jesus. This tells us that there are lives that do not need to speak, do not need to prove themselves, but simply stand there with their own truth, which is enough to shake long-standing foundations. That may be what the powers of death fear most, a person no longer controlled by death. Lazarus is no longer a person of two worlds. He has crossed the boundary, not to belong to the afterlife, but to return to this world with eyes that have seen the other side. That is what makes him dangerous. At a deeper level, Lazarus is the image of those who carry sacred wounds, who have died not biologically, but spiritually, whose faith has been extinguished, whose hearts have been crushed, whose identity has been erased, but who, in some inexplicable way, have come back to life. They are not as before. They no longer desire to control, compete, or dominate, but neither can anyone impose on them anymore, because those who have died and been raised are no longer afraid of death. Such people are sometimes very close to us. A quiet father who has forgiven childhood wounds, a mother who has overcome depression without anyone knowing, a friend who has survived marital breakdown but still keeps a gentle gaze. They are everyday Lazaruses, not preaching, not performing, but carrying the mark of a wound that has been called back to life. In ancient traditions, there is the concept of the wounded healer, one who heals not by strength, but by the wound itself, transformed into understanding and compassion. Lazarus did not become a pastor, but he became a living symbol of something deeper than teaching, a soul that has passed through the deepest darkness and been awakened by unconditional love. And that, more than any theory, touches the softest part of the human heart. Because if a person like that can step out, can be called by name, then every pain in the world has a door. In that context, resurrection is no longer the reversal of death, but the revival of the capacity to love, trust, and be present. Many live, but their hearts are dead. They no longer see beauty, no longer believe in goodness, no longer dare to love. They work, communicate, but inside is an empty space without light. The story of Lazarus does not come to say that death will always be pushed back, but that real life can return even in the darkest places that seem forever lost. Jesus did not promise to save Lazarus from pain, nor to prevent death, but he came to call him by name, and that was enough to reverse everything. And at the most sacred levels, the resurrection Lazarus experienced is what every soul is invited to dare to pass through its own death, whether it is the death of a belief, a dream, an identity, or an idea of God. And then to hear the call that transcends time, bringing them back to life, not dependent on victory or defeat, but simply on the pulse of compassion, the ability to get up, walk, and love. Lazarus did nothing to be raised. He only heard the call and responded. And perhaps that is the deepest thing a person needs, a call at the right moment, and a willingness to stand up, even if still wrapped in burial cloths. If the resurrection of Lazarus is an event that happened in history, its impact does not stop there. It becomes a pattern, a living metaphor for the journey of resurrection in every soul, every generation, every civilization. In the light of the Bible, resurrection is not an extraordinary moment for people to worship, but a sacred process that continues to unfold quietly. Death is not just the end of the body, but a symbol of every ending that seems hopeless. And resurrection, in a deeper sense, is not just breathing again, but returning to being human after all that has stripped away one's identity. Jesus did not come to Lazarus's tomb with force. He did not open the tomb, pull out the body, or lift him up. He called him by name, and that particular, gentle, yet powerful call is the center of the act of resurrection. In biblical culture, a name is not just a label, it is identity, the full recognition of a soul. When Jesus called Lazarus, he was giving him back his very self, beyond all the dust of death. This raises a question. In moments when we seem to have lost everything, is what we need most not an instant miracle, but someone who still remembers our name, who still believes we can get up? If we look at human history, there are countless Lazaruses forgotten in the tombs of war, discrimination, poverty, illness, and violence. But in every era, every movement, every act of humanity has been like a call, awakening souls tightly wrapped in despair, a wandering child brought back to school, an oppressed person restored to dignity, a wrongdoer forgiven and given a second chance. All these, though not as shocking as a corpse coming back to life, are also resurrection in a deeper, more human sense. They are calls in everyday life, and those who respond, even with a trembling step, have stepped out of their own darkness and become witnesses to the light. In a quantum perspective, every act of love, forgiveness, and kindness creates real changes. In the energy field of reality, a healing word does not vanish into the void. It creates waves, a timely hug, a non-judgmental gaze, a tear listened to all our calls that awaken the anonymous Lazaruses buried in silence. And if the resurrection of Lazarus is real, then today the revival of compassion, kindness, the courage to return, of souls daring to rise from ruin, is also real. Lazarus was raised but would die again. The Bible does not say where he went, how long he lived, or what he did afterward, because the focus of the story is not how long he lived, but that he was raised. That is the key point. Resurrection is not about the length of life, but the quality of presence after passing through death. Someone who has fallen into the depths but now walks with a gentler, quieter, steadier gaze is someone who carries within a kind of life that no one can take away. Death will come to all, but not everyone has lived again before dying. Lazarus is a whisper from history that you can be knocked down, swallowed by darkness, seen as finished, but there can still be a call, not from the crowd, not from a prophet, but from a deep place in the universe where the Creator whispers your name. And if you hear that call, do not fear the burial cloths, do not fear the smell of the past. Step out, even slowly, because as long as you can still respond, you have already begun to live again. The resurrection of Lazarus does not just mark a miracle that overcomes death, it poses a greater reversal. The logic of the world is overturned by a call of love. From the moment he stepped out of the tomb, Lazarus carried not just a revived body, but an undeniable presence, the presence of a person who had died and was now alive, as a testimony to the power of the one whom the religious leaders were trying to eliminate. That is why they wanted to kill him, not because he did or said anything wrong, but because his very existence was a living proof against all their arguments. This is still true today. Every person resurrected, however quietly, is a challenge to everything that wants to define people by failure, fate, or pain. Resurrection, in the most sacred sense, does not come from personal effort. It comes from a meeting point between the deepest brokenness and the most steadfast love. God did not come because Lazarus deserved it. He came because he loved. And because of that love, a dead man was called by name, and life began again. When we place this story beside the world of modern medicine, neuroscience, cardiology, and resuscitation technology, we see even more clearly that this is not just a story of survival, but of the deepest meaning of being called back to life, to exist as a living witness. If resurrection is real, not just biologically but spiritually, then it also leaves inevitable aftershocks. A person who has died and been raised cannot look at life the same way. Their joy does not come from victory, but from being able to sit and drink water, watch the wind blow, and be silent before a loved one. Their pain is no longer a cut, but a sediment that creates depth in their gaze. Perhaps Lazarus said nothing after the event, because language could not contain what he had experienced. Or perhaps he did not need to speak, because the eyes of someone who has died do not need explanation. Lazarus became a witness, but not a celebrity. The Bible lets him fade into the background, as if to say that resurrection is not to be noticed, but to live truly, not to preach or argue, but simply to live, but with a presence marked by holiness. That is enough to make others look at themselves. The greatest question is no longer what happens after death, but how to live after having died, not by personal effort, but by responding to the call, by the courage to step out of the darkness, even if still bound, trembling, wounded. And if you look deeply, you will see that there are things in you that have died: a dream, a belief, an innocence, a passion. You may have buried them, may still be tightly wrapped in the burial cloths of doubt, self-blame, or hardness. But if there is a call not from outside, but from the deepest place in your soul, calling your name, then you can step out of your tomb, not as before, but as a deeper, truer self. Someone who knows you have fallen and is therefore no longer afraid. Resurrection does not promise that everything will be easy, but that nothing will be meaningless. Because if life can grow from the stench of death, from the darkness of the tomb, then there is no place so hopeless that light cannot be. So, if you are still there, in your own tomb, then listen. You do not need to run. Just be ready to hear the call. Because the most sacred thing in the story of Lazarus is not death or life, but the ability to recognize when you are called by your own name, and that, from then until now, has never stopped. There is no final account written for Lazarus, no report of his second death, no line saying how, when, or where he died. The story only ends with him being called out of the tomb, and then silence. But perhaps that silence is the most perfect ending for a journey that has crossed the boundary of life and death. Because Lazarus was not raised to tell a story, he was raised to become the story. A story that does not need chapters or conclusions, because it is still unfolding in every wounded soul, every person who has passed through pain, and every one of us who, having fallen, can still hear a gentle call from deep in the darkness. In the journey of humanity, there are countless tombs without tombstones, where beautiful things are buried by failure, where good people are forgotten, where love that could not bloom has withered. But if the story of Lazarus is true, then no tomb is forever, no death is beyond being touched by a loving call. This does not change the laws of physics, but it opens a level of existence beyond matter, where every soul is still waiting to be called by name, where every pain can become light, every loss can become material for a new presence. Today, many live in modern society, but their souls are forgotten. They are not dead physically, but have stopped feeling, trusting, hoping. They work, communicate, exist, but inside is a cold part they dare not open. And then, one day, perhaps not by a spectacular miracle, but by a glance, a song, a line of scripture, a gentle word, something vibrates like a call, not loud, but at the right rhythm, the right name, and they suddenly realize they can still live, not just exist, but live with gentleness, courage, and truth. In that light, the story of Lazarus is no longer a story of the past, but a living whisper for the present, that there are wounds that do not need to be erased, but transformed, that there are deaths that are not endings, but thresholds to a deeper kind of life, that there is a call from the one who knows every fear, every wound, every death that has ever been, still sounding in the soul. Come out, step out of the tomb, be loosed, and live. And if we respond, even with a small movement of faith, we do not just step out of our own tombs, we become people marked by resurrection, who cannot fully explain what has happened, but know for sure that something sacred has touched us, and from then on, nothing is the same. You do not need to explain resurrection. You only need to live as one who has been called back to life. No one can argue with that, because when life is present, darkness cannot cover it, and a person who carries light in their heart, however quietly, will still shine in a world that seems to have forgotten the way back from the dead.